Section 2. Video 21. Composition versus Inheritance Part 1. We have three main objectives in this video. 1. We will point out that it is recommended to use composition instead of inheritance in React. 2. We will use the children prop to hold any elements between the opening and closing tag of the rendered component. 3. We will learn that specialized components are created in React by composition, where a more generic component is configured with props. Let's start with a blank file. React has a powerful composition model, and we recommend using composition instead of inheritance to reuse code between components. In this video, we will consider a few problems where developers new to React often reach for inheritance, and show how we can solve them with composition. Some components don't know their children ahead of time. This is especially common for components like a sidebar or a dialog that represent generic boxes. We recommend that such components use the special children prop to pass children elements directly into their output. To show an example, let's start off importing React and React DOM. We will also import the index.css file, because we will be adding some CSS styling. Ultimately, we want to render a custom React element called welcome dialog to the DOM. Now, let's define the welcome dialog component. We will have it return a div. As children to the div, we will show an h1 header element, with a class name of dialog title. And a paragraph element, with a class name of dialog message. We will add the class styles later. Now, let's say we wanted to put a thick colored border around the h1 and paragraph elements. We could do that by adding a class with some CSS to the encompassing div that holds them as children. On the other hand, if we wanted to create thick colored borders around other elements as well, it would be better to create a reusable component that could apply this styling to any elements. Let's call this component Fancy Border. We will add in place of the encompassing div. Now, we will create a prop called color and pass the string value of blue to it. Now, we will define the Fancy Border component. It will return a div with a class name whose value is determined by the color prop. Any elements between the opening and closing tag of the rendered Fancy Border component are automatically passed via props in a variable called children. Since Fancy Border renders props.children inside a div, the passed elements appear in the final output. Save the file, and observe that the h1 and paragraph render on the page. Now, let's go to index.css and add the CSS styles. First, let's add styles for the class dialog title. Make the margin 0. And the font family of sans serif. Next, we will increase the font size for the class dialog message. The Fancy Border class adds some padding and a solid, thick border. Finally, the fancy border -blue class sets the border color to blue. Let's go back to index.js. We will now turn to talking about specialization in the context of React. Sometimes we think about components as being special cases of other components. For example, we might say that a welcome dialog is a special case of a dialog. In React, this is also achieved by composition, where a more specific component renders a more generic one and configures it with props. We will create a more generic dialog component. Now, we will move the return expression of welcome dialog into the dialog component. And now we will make it more generic by making the title and message texts be provided via props. In welcome dialog, we will return the dialog element, passing in values for the props title and message. Save the file and observe that the same title and message render to the page. To summarize, we pointed out that it is recommended to use composition instead of inheritance in React. We used the children prop to hold any elements between the opening and closing tag of the rendered component. And we learned that specialized components are created in React by composition, where a more generic component is configured with props. In the next video, we will continue discussing composition versus inheritance.